Welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm Julian Marshall. In a moment, do America's European and NATO allies still see the United States as a reliable partner? Also in the programme, the BBC's Jonathan Head returns to northern Thailand and speaks to one of the British divers who helped save 13 schoolboys who were trapped in an underground flooded cave.
You know, we can all say they're very lucky, and they probably are, but they did amazingly well to survive those first 10 days.
But what about you? You can't go anywhere at the moment without somebody wanting to take a photograph of you. Will it change your life? And
No, I'm the same guy. I'm not a hero, just in the right place at the right time, really.
And that report in full later in this edition of News Hour. But first, as President Trump prepares to begin his third year in office, he finds himself increasingly without the heavyweight advisers and aides seen by many as the steady hands advising a man who took office in January 2017 without any political, diplomatic and military experience. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster is gone. White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Defence Secretary Jim Mattis are on their way out the door. For General Mattis, often referred to as the last adult in the room, Mr. Trump's decision this week to pull US troops out of Syria was a step too far. US Democrats and Republicans are dismayed, but there's also alarm in European capitals where General Mattis was seen as a firm supporter of the NATO transatlantic alliance. The French Defence Minister Florence Pally praised him as a strong ally.
What
I can say is that he is a colleague whom I appreciate very much, with whom I have worked a lot. He's a great soldier and has been a remarkable minister, and that he has been a partner at all times.
Well, Lithuania's membership of NATO serves as the best guarantor that in the event of conflict with Russia, Lithuania and indeed the other Baltic states of Estonia and Latvia, former Soviet republics, will not stand alone. Lithuania hosted a visit by General Mattis last year. Linas Linkevičius is Lithuania's foreign minister. What was his reaction to the resignation?
Saddened, or rather disappointed by this decision, which was a bit unexpected.
I mean, was it the unexpectedness of it, or was it to do with General Mattis himself and how he is perceived in Europe?
He was perceived as a quite consistent with a resolution, strong and predictable policy, and definitely some stability. I would add also very clear understanding of alliances, of the power of alliances, of transatlantic link, what is really, really very important. So all these features are important that will be missing. So I hope we will have somebody who will be successor, sharing these views and principles of General Mattis.
General Mattis, of course, was in Lithuania last year, and that must have been reassuring to you.
Absolutely. You know, it's very important in this time of uncertainty to distinguish really friends and foes. And in our case, Russia is among the latter, frankly, and we really should do our best in preparing our own, so to say, capabilities. But also very important to have this coordination from both sides of the Atlantic. So General Mattis was exactly pursuing these goals, and that's what will be missing.
It would appear that the policy statements from the Trump administration are becoming more and more unexpected. Troop withdrawals from Syria, troop withdrawals from Afghanistan, where, of course, Lithuania has been involved in the NATO-led operation. Did you know about Afghanistan?
No, we didn't know that, and you're quite right. All these radical forces, jihadists, are still on the war, and definitely to declare victory would be a bit maybe too early. And frankly, this is also explains why we are concerned, because if the United States leaving, this vacuum is filled by others. When we're talking about Syria, so definitely will be filled by Russia and Iran. And that will be consequences. So why we are really concerned about development of the situation, and we believe it will be thoroughly considered or reconsidered or still discussed within the United States administration and also discussed with the allies.
Do you feel that under a Trump administration that the United States is committed to the defence of Lithuania if you, for instance, should become involved in another shooting war with Russia?
I can answer to you positively, because when we're comparing what was before, what is happening now, footprint on the ground, presence, also material support to our security, really very proactive. And that was the result of this administration. So why I'm saying that, I cannot believe that something would change radically or dramatically. But I also said that we will miss one of the architects of that, not just predictability, but really resolution and very clear position. We need that desperately, especially now in the environment of such an uncertainty. Definitely we cannot afford to meet these challenges alone, nationally, not just Lithuania, but also Latvia, also Estonia. And here we believe what we're doing in terms of NATO, and in addition, nationally with the United States, it's really a decisive factor to withstand pressure from other side, because unfortunately Russian behavior lately everywhere in the world, but also in our continent, let's mention just Ukraine, is very aggressive and not going to change. So we really need something to account.
That was Lithuania's Foreign Minister Linas Linkevičius. I've also been speaking to the BBC's Barbara Plett-Usher in Washington, who explained who might be in the running to replace General Mattis.
There's the name of the retired Army general named Jack Keane, also that of Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence. But they have recently expressed support for Mr. Mattis and his positions since he quit. So it might be hard for them to take over after him, maybe for any military or security person, actually, because he was universally admired in the military. It might more likely be an ideological politician, such as Senator Tom Cotton. He's a combat vet and top defense hawk whose name has been put out there. And also perhaps somebody like Deputy Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, who has a corporate background with Boeing. His name has been mentioned as well.
And this, of course, has not been the best of months for President Trump.
No, he's had quite a few bad stories. His lawyer, Michael Cohen, implicating him in some sort of criminal activity, stock market falling, the loss of his interior minister, and so on. So the suggestion is that that some of this is about him trying to deflect attention from all that bad news. But even more than that, the feeling that he has probably decided he needs to shore up his political base given all that bad news, and hence his focus on fulfilling campaign promises to bring foreign troops back, or troops back from foreign countries, but also to build that wall on the Mexican border, because he's being criticized actually quite strongly by supporters on the hard right for failing to do that.
And his insistence on building that wall and finding the finance for it means that a federal government shutdown is looming.
Yes, and it looks as if it's going to happen at this point. The Senate has started a series of votes now on whether to pass a bill that would include $5 billion for the wall. That's a government spending bill that would include $5 billion for the wall, and they'll almost certainly not be able to do it because they'll need some Democratic support, and they won't get it. And also they're having to wait for a lot of senators to come back who had gone home for Christmas, so that's still going on. But the most likely scenario is there will be a partial government shutdown tonight, and probably over Christmas.
That was our correspondent in Washington, the BBC's Barbara Plett-Usher. The UN Security Council has voted unanimously to send a team of observers to monitor and help implement a ceasefire in the Hodeidah region of Yemen, where there is a crucial port. The truce began on Tuesday after being agreed at UN-sponsored talks last week in Sweden between delegations from the Yemeni government and Houthi rebels. Britain drafted the resolution. Britain's UN ambassador is Karen Pierce. How many observers will be deployed, and when?
My understanding is that a very initial wave of 8 will go with General Patrick Kammert. He's a Dutch general. He's got a very distinguished track record of leading UN operations. But that's just the very first advance team. And then over the following days, that team will build up. I understand to 30, but the UN are still refining the numbers, and the Secretary-General has been given, by the resolution we passed today, he's been given authority to keep a team in the area for 30 days without coming back to the Security Council. And in the meantime, he has until the end of December for the UN to work up a detailed plan of what a permanent monitoring presence will look like on the ground.
So that monitoring presence could ultimately run into the hundreds.
I've heard a figure of around 150 mentioned, but the UN will now be doing all their planning and logistical work to work out what numbers would be sensible for the task that they have to do. The UN has got onto this pretty quickly, and the Security Council wanted to give the Secretary-General a blanket authorisation so that we could get the mission in as fast as possible. We don't usually give blanket authorisations, but obviously this is a special case.
Well, be it 30, be it 150, that doesn't seem an awful lot to keep the warring factions apart.
Well, it will be guided by what General Kamat thinks he needs when he gets there and can see the situation. As I say, this is a number I have heard mentioned. The UN is now producing detailed plans, so we'll look forward to getting those.
Deployed under Chapter 5?
The resolution that we passed didn't specify which chapter they will go under. They are not going under a Chapter 7 resolution. The Chapter 7 resolution is typically reserved for the use of force, and it's been made clear by the Secretary-General that these monitors will not be armed. The resolution doesn't specify any of the other relevant chapters, but the point is it has the full backing of the Security Council, it has the full backing of the parties, and it's been led by a Dutch general with an outstanding record. So I think the UN is really trying hard here to get something started as fast as possible.
It appears that this resolution was the result of some fairly tortuous negotiations. The United States wasn't entirely happy with your original draft and wanted it amended. Could you tell me what the problem was?
Well, I think this happens quite a lot in negotiations, to be honest. Different countries want different things, and the art of diplomatic negotiation is to get them all to a text that's both meaningful and purposeful and can ideally attract 15 votes. So that's what we were able to do on this occasion. All members of the Security Council had to compromise on their ideal demands to get us there. But the most important thing is that it endorses Stockholm and supports the humanitarian requirements.
Is it the case that Britain would have liked to have seen the accountability of the warring parties to war crimes in the conflict, but the United States said no?
We were one of the countries who attaches enormous importance to upholding international humanitarian law, particularly the three principles of necessity, proportionality and distinction. And that's very important for us. And we do expect when humanitarian law is violated, there to be credible and transparent investigations. In the time available, it wasn't possible to get that explicit reference into the resolution, but it doesn't mean that that requirement has gone away. A number of Security Council members feel as strongly as we do, and we will be looking for all violations of international humanitarian law to be properly investigated.
Britain's UN Ambassador, Dame Karen Pierce. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is News Hour, and now to Thailand and to a town in the north on the Burmese border that's become famous around the world because of a story about 13 boys who got trapped in a cave. Back in the summer, what many describe as a miraculous rescue of the wild boar footballers and their coach dominated our headlines for weeks. Our Southeast Asia correspondent, Jonathan Head, went back to Tam Luang Cave to see how the story has changed the community there.
It's been 5 months since I was here at the entrance to the cave, and it's all very different now. Gone are the armies of volunteers and the divers coming out to have their tanks filled, the pumps bringing out torrents of water, the mud everywhere spattering the journalists. In its place, there's a brand new museum building which will commemorate the extraordinary rescue that took place here, and a plinth where shortly they'll be erecting a statue of Saman Gunan, the Thai diver who died during that rescue attempt. And of course the 12 boys and their coach will be here to witness it. They arrived on a motorcade of vintage cars behind the truck carrying the statue, all in neat purple shirts, looking cheerful and a lot less skinny than the last time we saw them. Many of the Thai divers, volunteers and officials involved in the rescue were also there, and 3 of the foreign volunteers. who hugged each of the boys whose lives they'd saved. British caver Vern Unsworth was one of the first on the scene after they'd disappeared back in June, and he used his intimate knowledge of Tam Luang to help guide the divers. These days he's a local celebrity.
For me, it's still quite emotional. Yeah, they're family. You know, we can all say they're very lucky, and they probably are, but they did amazingly well to survive those first 10 days.
But what about you? You can't go anywhere at the moment without somebody wanting to take a photograph of you.
Yeah,
You've become a celebrity.
I think I should start charging, don't you?
Will it change your life? And
No,
will you...
I'm the same guy. I'm not a hero. Just in the right place at the right time, really.
The Thai government won't allow the boys or their families to be interviewed without a lengthy screening process. But I did manage to speak briefly with Coach Ek, who shared their ordeal in the cave. I feel great, he said, but he thinks of Saman Gunan every day and thanks him. The massive rescue operation disrupted the lives of local people, damaging many of their farms. But today they're being repaid for their sacrifice. From just a handful of visitors a day, there are now thousands drawn by the dramatic rescue story.
I want to see the real place that they stuck in the cave, so I have a chance to come to Chiang Rai, so I decided to go here.
We've been here since first thing this morning, and the flow of tourists just hasn't stopped. And as a result of that, the entire road going for at least 500 metres on either side of the entrance to the cave is lined with stalls selling actually a fantastic variety of local produce. This has made a very big difference to the local economy. There's a lady selling rather delicious looking grilled sausages and pork here. Sawadi Kap. How have things changed for you and the other people living around here since the rescue?
She's local people, and she usually sells her food at the market, but now she sells it here and her sales better.
Yeah, stay done. Little ripple. Let's go.
The boys' lives have returned to their old routines. School, of course, and football training, though it's not quite as it was. This is a coaching session offered by Manchester City, and they've already visited Argentina, London and Manchester United.
Body as a shield. Good.
The most famous young footballers in the world are still getting plenty of international attention.
That was our Southeast Asia correspondent Jonathan Head with that report from Tam Luang in Thailand. President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan survived the Arab Spring of 2011 that saw the end of so many dictatorial regimes in North Africa and the Arab world. But protesters have been out on the streets of the capital, Khartoum, this week and other towns chanting such slogans as "The people want the fall of the regime" and "Freedom, freedom." They've taken to the streets over the rising price of bread and fuel. Police have used tear gas, while a number of people have been killed in the course of the demonstrations. So why have the prices of bread and fuel gone up? Dame Rosalind Marsden is a former British ambassador to Sudan and now with the Chatham House think tank in London.
Sudan has been experiencing an increasingly severe economic crisis for some time, including high inflation and a sharp depreciation of the currency. The economy has been suffering since the secession of South Sudan, which meant that Sudan was deprived of quite a lot of its former oil resources. And as a result of this economic crisis, there has been a sharp rise in food prices. There have been fuel shortages, lack of essential medicines, and now lack of cash in the ATMs. So all of this has been provoking, this has caused serious hardship for the people of Sudan. And as you mentioned, this week has provoked countrywide protests.
And those protests very rapidly turning into calls for the fall of the regime.
Yes, I've been watching over the last few days videos on social media of some of these demonstrations, and it's been quite striking that many of the slogans being chanted are not just about the price of bread, but they're also calling for freedoms and regime change.
And can the president survive such calls, such protests? Some witness reports say that the military wasn't doing an awful lot to stop protesters.
Well, that appeared to be the case in one town in the northern part of Sudan. This is Atbara, which is a railway town in the north, where it did appear that trucks full of soldiers were sort of joining the protesters rather than trying to control the situation. However, in the rest of the country, we've seen a rather different picture. There have been reports that at least 9 protesters have been shot by security officers and dozens of others injured. So that's the current situation, obviously of great concern, given that in September 2013, when we saw the last really major protests, up to 200 protesters are reported to have been killed by government security forces. And then again in January this year, when there were some peaceful demonstrations in Khartoum, some 150 or so opposition politicians and human rights activists were detained for up to 2 to 3 months without charge.
That was Dame Rosalind Marsden, a former British ambassador to Sudan, and now with the Chatham House think tank in London. And don't forget, if you want to listen to News Hub but miss the live broadcast, podcast of the programme is available, updated twice a day. Just type into your search engine BBC News Hub podcast and you'll find it there. You can also subscribe to the feed if you want to receive it on a regular basis. Do stay with us, though, with this edition of the programme, and a lot more to come in the next 30 minutes. Coming up next, what kind of deal has Mexico reached with the US on Central American migrants seeking asylum in the United States? But first, Britain's second largest airport, Gatwick, briefly reopened today after illegal drone flights over the runway caused the cancellation of hundreds of flights and left tens of thousands of passengers stranded, but was forced to close again after another confirmed drone sighting and then reopened. Police are still searching for the drone operators, but it's understood that military equipment is now being used which can jam signals to the rogue devices as well as track them. Simon Calder is the travel editor of the Independent newspaper. What did he make of that further drone sighting?
I've spoken to some people in aviation security who, bizarre as it might seem, given that there's been so much emotional cost as well as the financial cost of 150,000 people not being where they want to be, and they're actually very glad that whoever the so-called drone ranger is has been exposing weaknesses to aviation security. That is extremely worrying.
And the possibility of identifying the operator?
It's a small area. I know the area around Gatwick Airport in West Sussex, south of London, very well. I think it's a strong likelihood that if it is a local person, that he or she or they will be detected at some stage. But whatever their motives, they have caused immense disruption, immense costs, and made a point that civil aviation is unfortunately vulnerable.
So what thought is being given, therefore, to prevent a reoccurrence of this? There's been talk of the military using equipment to jam drone signals.
Yes, there's. If you go to Tel Aviv in Israel, or indeed many other parts of Israel, there are very, very high levels of security deployed against the threat of drones because those have been used militarily against Israel. And so therefore, there are plenty of technological solutions of many kinds, some of them electronic, some of them almost medieval, using birds of prey. Civil aviation, both in the UK, more widely in Europe, and I guess around the world, hasn't really thought too much about it.
And this is going to mean a mounting bill for both passengers, airlines and airports.
It certainly is. I think just with the Gatwick Airport disruption alone, we're up to about $15 million. That's partly the lost revenue of airlines, which they would at this time of year normally be earning an absolute fortune from the very high fares they can charge in the build-up to Christmas, and partly the costs of providing the duty of care that they are obliged to do under European legislation. So it's very, very expensive. Ultimately, of course, the passenger will pay because the airlines and airports will pass on the costs.
That was Simon Calder, the travel editor of Britain's independent newspaper. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour. For as long as President Trump can't get his wall built on the US border with Mexico, he's been exploring other ways of keeping migrants out of the United States. In recent months, thousands of Central Americans have been travelling north to seek asylum in the US. The previous Mexican government of President Nieto appeared to cooperate with the United States in trying to deter the migrants from crossing into Mexico from Guatemala and then trying to encourage them to return home. But the new president, López Obrador, campaigned on easing migration to the United States. So where does it stand on a new US policy announced on Thursday, under which Mexico will house asylum seekers in Mexico while their cases are adjudicated in the United States? Robert Velasco is the spokesperson for the Mexican Foreign Ministry.
Let me tell you two things about this. The first one is that yesterday at 8 a.m. we received a notification from the U.S. government regarding these new measures that they will be implementing. And our response is that we will accept these migrants while they wait for a U.S. court resolution regarding their asylum applications. And we will provide them with humanitarian visas, which allow them to work in Mexico while they're waiting for this. It's obviously consistent with our law and with our commitment to a humanitarian treatment of migrants. Second, the truth is, and this is very important to say, is that we already are in a situation where migrants are waiting for long periods of time on our side of the border, because nor yesterday nor today, we don't have any control of how many people the U.S. accepts for asylum claim processing.
So what you are saying, that this is an agreed policy between the United States and Mexico, that thousands of Central American migrants will remain in Mexico while their asylum applications are processed?
Let me be very clear about this. That's not what I'm saying. This is not a deal between the U.S. and Mexico. What we're facing is a new decision by the U.S. government, and we are responding to it as best as we can from our side of the border. And we were a few days ago in a situation that is similar. The U.S. has decided to slow down the number of asylum claims that it processes every day. So a lot of people is waiting on our side of the border for a chance to be heard with a CBP officer to present what they call a credible fear interview. Basically, we're just responding to U.S. policy.
A lot of these migrants are not going to gain asylum, are they, in the United States, which then leaves them on Mexican territory? You're happy to have them stay, are you?
Well, we will have a number of people, of course, that we will accept for this. We were very clear yesterday that we still are preserving our sovereignty for deciding who comes in and who cannot come in. We have presented this week also a new migration policy that is more progressive than what we had before. And we're trying to provide opportunities for migrants both in Mexico, for Central American migrants both in Mexico, and especially in their communities of origin, which is something that we've been working very hard with the Central American countries of the Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala.
Your president campaigned as a vocal critic of President Trump. He called him erratic and arrogant and compared the president's comments about Mexicans to the treatment of Jewish people by Nazis. How would you respond to those who would say that he is now acquiescing to President Trump?
Well, I could say two things. The first one is that we're not acquiescing to President Trump. We're trying to provide migrants with a humanitarian treatment as best as we can and according to our possibilities and to limitations of Mexican government. The second thing is that, I don't know what was said during the campaign, but we're now in a different stage, obviously, and we're trying to act accordingly.
I mean, could it just be that this week's announcement of $10.6 billion in US development aid to Mexico has made it a lot easier for you to enunciate this new policy?
No, what I could say is that our strategy with the US has been to focus on the issues where we have a coincidence, such as this program that we announced on Tuesday, this declaration of principles. And of course, there are some other issues on which we don't have a level of understanding where our approaches differ. And this is one of such cases.
That was Robert Velasco, a spokesperson for the Mexican Foreign Ministry. And listening to that interview was John Lee Anderson, a foreign correspondent for the New Yorker magazine, who's written extensively about Mexico. Does he think that the new Mexican government has acquiesced to President Trump?
I think we have to wait a little while to be absolutely sure of what the Mexican strategy is. But I think what you see is what you get. There's no doubt that by agreeing to allow the Trump administration to send asylum seekers, Central America asylum seekers back into Mexico to wait for their hearings is an acquiescence to U.S. posturing. Yeah, no doubt. Now, exactly what the subset of the Mexican strategy is remains to be seen. I know and have met with Mr. López Obrador, the recently sworn-in president, as well as his foreign minister, Marcelo Ebrard, and they're astute figures and very different, in my estimation, to their predecessors, the very pliant Peña Nieto administration, which acquiesced repeatedly to Trump in the 2 years the two administrations overlapped. So it's my sense that while there's no love lost on the Mexican side for this White House, for sure, the U.S. still comes at Mexico with a preponderant degree of clout. And so, to use a boxing term, I think the Mexicans are forced to do a bit of rope-a-dope. And I think that's maybe what we're seeing here. I don't believe that they are likely to be meek and mild compromisers or accommodationists to everything the Trump administration wants. But at first glance, this does look like a win for the White House and for Trump at a time in which he is being more macho than ever in his swaggering and posturing over immigration and over the wall. He's flailing out on all fronts, as you know.
But from what Mr. Velasco was saying, it appears that the Mexican government hasn't really thought this through. He did concede that even at the moment, those migrants would have to wait weeks, possibly months, to hear the outcome of their asylum applications. But now there are likely to be thousands of those migrants stationed in Mexican border towns for an indefinite period, and there has been hostility towards them.
It's true. The border areas, some of them in particular, Tijuana, Tamaulipas, further to the east, are extremely dangerous areas where drug cartels essentially run things. However, López Obrador administration does have plans that it plans to put into motion for investing in the border area. He's declared, I think it's a 25 or 30 kilometer duty-free ban, and to promote more, including U.S. investment in Mexican side of the border. He has what he calls a Marshall Plan to invest, and he's got the U.S. to agree to earmark $10 billion into the Central American countries where the immigrants are coming from. López Obrador's administration has promised $25 billion for southern Mexico, which is precisely this very economically devastated area from where most of the immigrants are coming from. So although, in a sense, this is putting the cart before the horse, and what you point out is certainly true, that it's difficult to see how the Mexicans, given the situation, have the infrastructure and wherewithal, not to mention the administrative procedures or law enforcement capable of dealing with more migrants piling up on their shores. What Velasco said is also true, which is that this merely officializes fait accompli. There already are tens of thousands of migrants waiting in Mexican border towns. It sounds like they were presented with a deal that they couldn't refuse and that they're trying to dress it up a little bit.
The New Yorker's John Lee Anderson is reported frequently from Latin America. Now, you may remember a story that we ran earlier this year about a Ukrainian soldier who's been missing in action in Afghanistan since 1988. The tale of Igor Belukharov caused a media sensation in Ukraine when in February a man suffering memory loss and matching his description came forward near the town of Mazar-e-Sharif. When shown photos, his elderly mother was convinced her son had been found, but as time has passed, she's become ever more upset that nothing has been done to bring him home. The BBC's Jonah Fisher has this report from Ukraine.
Good day, Granny. Don't cry, don't cry.
It means you brought good news?
Imagine believing your son died 30 years ago, and then out of the blue, being told he just might be alive. Antonina Bilokurova has spent 2018 waiting for the truth. This story begins back in 1988, when Antonina's son Igor went missing while fighting with the Soviet army in Afghanistan. His body was never found, but as the years passed, it was assumed that he died. When I visited Antonina's village in June, she showed me the gravestone she'd had made.
I was worried that when I died, he'd be forgotten.
In February, Antonina's life was turned on its head. A group of Ukrainians who were visiting Afghanistan were approached by a mystery man. He appeared to have lost his memory and spoke no Russian or Ukrainian. But he did say the words Ukraine and Volyn, the region that Igor comes from. Military records were quickly checked, and Antonina notified that Igor just might have been found. With the incredible story, headline news, we visited Antonina at her home and asked her to compare photos.
These were the pictures that were taken.
That's him. Oh, my son.
What is it that makes you recognize him?
The eyes, small ears. Only for some reason his mouth is small and here it's big. Oh, maybe he's smiling a bit.
But despite her conviction, progress has been slow. Igor's family has now been waiting a very long 10 months to find out whether this man in Afghanistan is really him. With no end in sight, they agreed to let us carry out a DNA test on their behalf to resolve this issue once and for all. Oleg Choyko, a veteran of the Soviet war in Afghanistan, has been helping us, and we followed as he delivered the result.
This envelope is sealed. We'll open it in your presence if you give us your blessing.
I've been waiting for this for 30 years.
The motherhood probability on all indicators is 0. Antonina, I'm sorry, but he's not your son.
Not him?
Not him.
I'm sorry. I really wanted it to be him too. I'm so sorry that we had to bring you bad news.
I'm very grateful that you tried to help, that you tried to bring good news, and to bring my son back.
As for what took place in Afghanistan and what the mystery man was up to, well, like most of this strange and sad story, it now looks certain to remain unresolved.
That report from the BBC's Jonah Fisher in Ukraine. You're listening to the BBC World Service, and in case you hadn't noticed, 2018 is rapidly drawing to a close, which means for us here at NewsHour, it's time for what they call seasonal fun.
Over the years,
James and Rebecca, 21.
James Menendez and Rebecca Kesby have worked together as a team to dominate the annual NewsHour quiz.
This year's winners, Rebecca and James.
Raz and Tim, 15 points. James and Rebecca, 21.
But in a year defined for many by conflict and division, just how will they cope as opponents?
I'm afraid to tell you that you are both sitting in the wrong seats. That's right, it is a surprise team shuffle.
I don't think we were consulted about.
No, you weren't, but we're going to split them up this year.
And the gloves are off.
James.
White rhino.
Correct. Very good.
I don't
Paper
think
tells
my
me
buzzer
will
works.
do indeed.
It's not your buzzer.
Oh. Look at that.
Look at that.
The estrangement kicks in.
10 minutes and it becomes Kathy.
It was always a marriage of convenience.
It wasn't a just.
It's presenter versus presenter in the newsroom grudge match you won't want to miss. The 2018 News Quiz on December the 25th, here on NewsHour.
And you can hear the ritual humiliation for the NewsHour team in the second half of the programme on Tuesday. And of course, if you're busy doing other things, you can always download a special extended edition of the quiz via our podcast feed from the 25th. The Afghan President Ashraf Ghani faces huge challenges. Peace talks with the Taliban, new threats from so-called Islamic State, also known as Daesh, as well as presidential elections in April. Now he also faces the prospect of US troop withdrawal from his country. Ashraf Ghani has been speaking to my colleague Martha Carney. The interview was recorded before the US Defense Secretary's resignation and reports that US troop withdrawals would happen.
The casualties between 2001 and December 31, 2014 were very heavily international. Since January 2015, international casualties have been 72, while our sacrifice has been for over 45,000. A vacuum that people thought could not be filled. We are now not only dying for our own freedom, but for your security. We are the front line. The first issue is the mischaracterization of this war. This is not a war in Afghanistan. It's a war over Afghanistan. But the threat of terrorism is still present and clear.
And I suppose the question is, who is winning that war? And we look at the kind of territory that the Taliban is controlling, 60%, some people will say. The fact that they're able to carry out attacks in all parts of the country, including in Kabul. I mean, you can't say that the Taliban are losing, can you?
You can't say that they're winning either. We need to really be clear. First, when they say 60% of the territory, how many districts? This is a figment of somebody's imagination. The number of districts that actually have fallen is very small. Our ability to project force is very significant and has grown during these 4 years very, very substantially.
But still, the Taliban won't engage directly with your government. Some would say you've made a number of concessions to them. You didn't set preconditions for any of the talks. You announced the amnesty, the ceasefire. So how is that deadlock going to be got rid of?
What we argue, there is a moment in wars when it's ripe for solution. We think it's that moment.
So what kind of timetable do you think you're talking about? I know some people have thought perhaps this could be resolved in some way by April.
Speed can happen, but also we need to be cautious. I'm cautiously optimistic. I cannot give you a specific timeline because a society's consensus is not like building a dam. A peace process is not a straight line. We're not going to look back. We are now committed to a political solution, to just and lasting peace. And that means we have to be ready to examine every opportunity and take advantage of it.
It's not just the Taliban, though, that you're having to deal with politically but militarily, but now also the group known as Islamic State. And talking to British military commanders, they see ISK, as they're called here, a real threat. Do you agree?
The threat is real. Daesh was a significant threat, could become even more significant after peace. Because of that, we should have a robust counterterrorism framework. The issue is a struggle over Afghanistan. It's our location that is either solid gold in terms of a platform for regional and global cooperation, because without us, the economic integration of Asia cannot be complete. These networks, transnational networks of terrorism and transnational criminal organization, want this country to be unstable, because an unstable country provides them for the launching ground, in the breeding ground.
And we've seen where that led in the past with Al-Qaeda and with 9/11. So you're saying that even if you do manage to reach a peace deal with the Taliban, you'll still have Islamic State to deal with.
State, but what's the difference? The difference is that Taliban are a local phenomenon. Daesh is not Afghan. It's overwhelmingly foreign. And war is a relationship. They need to be solved within a political framework of belonging, which the key of which is citizenship rights, being able to create a framework where people accept each other, reconcile to them. But foreign intrusion is a different phenomenon. We have no precedent for a peace with international terrorist groups anywhere in the world.
How much do you think you can rely on continuing US military support here in Afghanistan? We've just seen President Trump make his decision to withdraw American troops from Syria.
The daily operations, the fighting and the dying is done by us. So we've done the first part. I was responsible during President Karzai's presidency for the transition of security forces, and we did it, completed. Second issue is money. We're now relentlessly focused on raising the resources domestically to pay for our security forces so it would not be a burden. Third is national interest. Countries don't have permanent friends, as Lord Palmerston said, or permanent enemies. They have permanent interests. The United States is here with us because of its global and national security interest. So it's an interest-based discussion. We're not asking for a charity case. We're asking for partnership that is meaningful.
That was the President of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, speaking to the BBC's Martha Carney. And that's it from this edition of NewsHour. From me, Julian Marshall, and the rest of the team in London, goodbye.
NewsHour has been a download from the BBC. To discover more and our terms of use, visit bbc.com/podcasts.